Welcome, everyone. And thank you a lot. Thank you very much, David Rose, for hosting, for doing our workshop today, a masterclass. For the next 2 hours, we will hear from David Rose on what to do and what not to do, and what to consider when expanding into the US, and many more things, I'm sure. I am not going to take up a lot of your time now. I will hand over to David. And I will be here during the full meeting, David, and just let me know if there's any functions or things you need me to do. And I will also make you a co-host, and we should be good to go.
All right. Thank you, Christian. Hi, everyone. Good to meet you. Let me share my screen here. All right, Christian, is that full screen? How's that looking?
It is, and we have a small screen of you on the left side.
All right, perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm David Rose. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be doing a double masterclass per GNet's request. So we have two masterclasses in one today. The first one, we're going to cover the essentials you need to know if you're expanding to the US. And then we're going to take a deep dive into fundraising in the US. And hopefully give you the information you'll need to know to be successful in both ventures. Just by background, so I'm the CEO of US Expansion Partners, and we help European tech companies launch and scale in the US. Professionally, I've done 5 venture-backed tech startups, and I'm a 3-time CEO. And I've been involved with venture-backed tech startups for a long time, and I've done a lot of the things that venture tech startups do here. I've Google Demo Day finalist. I've demoed at TechCrunch Disrupt, and I've made hundreds of A-round venture pitches here in the US. So the first give you some ideas of the things we're going to talk about is when you first come to the US, there's a whole bunch of items you're going to have to get help with or figure out. And so these are all the list of items we're going to go through today. And it can provide a high-level overview of each of these things, and then we'll dig in probably in much greater detail when we get to the venture capital fundraising piece. So if you're probably coming to the US, the first thing you're going to want to do is create a corporate entity here in the US. And I'm sure you've probably heard people talk about Delaware C Corporation. So I want to talk about that for just a second. When you incorporate in the US, in most states, or in most countries, there's a single government entity. One of the complexities of doing business in the US, there's a federal government, and then there's 50 individual states governments. And when you actually incorporate in the US and form a corporation, you actually incorporate at the state level. So you need to pick a state where your entity will be formed. The most common place to do that here in the US, you may have heard of a Delaware C Corporation. So what's happened is the state laws all vary a little bit, and the US business community, and especially the venture capital community, have kind of consolidated around the rules of governance in the state of Delaware. So that's the most common place to incorporate in the US. And I think one question we get immediately is, gosh, if we create a Delaware C Corporation, does our company need to be located in Delaware? And the answer is no. Just by example, I've been the CEO of 3 Delaware C corporations, and I've never once been to the state of Delaware. So you can definitely have your company located anywhere in the US, even though you're a Delaware C corporation. And as part of that process, you'll need to fill out paperwork to create the C corporation. You'll create what's called articles of incorporation and bylaws, and you'll name officers for the corporation. And these steps will be important later. So you're going to create the C corporation, again, most commonly in Delaware. You're going to need to get what's called a federal identification number from the US federal government, or IRS, FEIN, and that'll be your federal identification number. And then you're going to pick a state where your company is going to be located. And this would be your state of domicile. So for example, you may be a Delaware C corporation, but you may be domiciled in Atlanta, Georgia, or New York, New York, or Miami, Florida. And once you have a state of domicile, you'll also need to register in the state, not only as what's called a foreign company, but also you need to get tax withholding numbers for withholding taxes for payroll. So again, you're going to form a C corporation in a state. You're going to get a federal identification number, and you're going to pick a state where you're going to operate. So these are kind of the functional things to create a US entity, kind of the starting point for all these things. The next thing we're going to talk a little bit about is accounting. So once you have your entity, one of the things you're going to find when you set up your U.S. corporation, you essentially set it up as a distributor for your parent company. So you're going to have a separate accounting operations. So you're going to have, accounting software. You're going to do monthly financial reporting, do accounts receivables and payables. You do your contracts and those type of things out of here. And then you're also going to want to work with what's called here in the U.S. a certified public accounting firm or CPA firm. And they're going to do a couple things. They're going to, you're going to have a federal tax return you're going to file annually, probably like you do where you are now. But you're also going to need to file state tax returns for each state where you have operations or people. So you're going to file federal tax returns and state tax returns. The other thing you'll need to get is what's called a transfer pricing determination. So initially, when companies first started working across multiple jurisdictions, they would load up all their expenses in the really high tax jurisdictions, and they'd load up all their revenue in the really low tax jurisdictions to kind of maximize that. And governments got wise to this. So now when you have a subsidiary in another country, in this case, the US, you have to have a third party come in and do what's called a transfer pricing determination. So a third party has to decide how much you're going to charge for software, for example, or support, and how much those fees are set up in advance between the parent company and the subsidiary in the US. So this is a one-time transaction. It's kind of expensive to do, but once you have it done, then you basically just do it one time. So no problem there. So the next thing you'll want to do is set up a US bank. Now, this is much more complicated than it should be or what it might sound like. So the rest of the world uses the SWIFT system to move money. Of course, the US is kind of like the metric system and the standard. Of course, the US doesn't use the SWIFT system, even though the rest of the world does. So the US uses what's called the automated clearinghouse or ACH system to move money within the US. So if you're going to do business in the US, if you're going to pay employees, if you're going to pay vendors, you're going to need to have your own US bank account because you're going to have to move money through the ACH system. You can transfer money between the ACH system and the SWIFT system, but it's very expensive and cumbersome, and you really can't transact that way on a regular basis. So you're going to need a US bank to do business here. And the things you're going to need to get a bank account here in the US, it's much more challenging than you might think. The US banking system is highly regulated. So there are what's called KYC or know your customer challenges here for banks. And they essentially say, to the banks, you have to actually know your customers and what business they're in. It's essentially anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism laws. So if, for example, if I'm a bank, I can't just say, gosh, Christian seemed like a really nice guy. I had no idea he was a global money launderer, right? That doesn't fly anymore. I'm liable in that case. So in the US, the banks literally have to certify who their customers are. So it makes it very problematic if you're coming from the Nordics to the US to open a bank account, even if you have millions of dollars in the bank, and you call one of the major US banks, so you call Bank of America, for example, and open an account, they most likely won't call you back because they just don't have the infrastructure or processes in place to do the KYC verification for countries or companies coming from other countries. So it's a bit of a challenge. Now, there's ways around this. So there are regional banks that we work with that are anxious to bank tech companies coming to the US. So smaller regional banks, and also some international banks. So for example, HSBC can open a US bank account from London. And so if your bank right now can open a US account for you before you even come, that makes your life much simpler. But there are certain things that you're going to be required to have to open a bank account in the US. You're going to need a physical address that can be verified. So we're going to talk more about virtual offices versus actual offices later, but you'll need a physical address. You'll need the federal identification number we talked about, the articles of incorporation from the state where you're incorporated, and you also have named officers, and those named officers will have certain roles and responsibilities, and one of them is opening a bank account. Now, one of the things that's nice is, especially with these regional banks, you won't actually have to come to the US to open the account. So you don't have to be on site to do it, but we will have to verify identification through passport photos and those type of things. So anyway, it's a little challenging, not as easy as it should be, but we can definitely help you get banking set up in the US. And by the way, I should have said this before we got started. I'm happy to share this deck out, so don't feel like you have to take copious notes or anything. And we'll be happy to send this out to everyone who participated. So the next piece of the process in opening the US is US site selection. And we talked a little bit about it a second ago. So there's a kind of a trend of virtual offices that are popular in the US where you can pay just a few dollars a month and you can have an address. there are certain downsides of that. So for example, if you want to have, if you want to get a visa for immigration, or if you want to go through and get your bank account, you're going to have a physical office address that can be verified for due diligence, whether it be insurance or banking. And so there are a lot of physical office options that are low cost, and you don't have to pay or commit to a long term for the rent. So, even a WeWork will be fine, because you actually have a physical office. They can collect your address or collect your mail. You have a physical address that can be verified. But what you don't want to do is sign up for these virtual office companies. We have a client who has a virtual office in Miami. They don't have any people there, but they wanted to be in Miami since they're in the Web3 space. And I use the same company to look for an office space where I live here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, part of the Research Triangle Park area. And the address that this company provides in my city is of a BP gas station. And what you don't want to have, if someone's doing due diligence on your company to launch your business here in the US, you don't want them to look you up on Google Maps and see that your address is at a BP gas station. So just get a physical office. If you're coming to the US, just make that investment. It's worth it. There are a whole host of items we talk to companies about as far as the variables to consider when coming to the US. The first one always kind of surprises people. The most important one I would tell you is operating hour overlay. So if you're coming from the Nordics to the US, if your company is located on the East Coast of the US, you're going to have 4 or more hours of operating overlap with the parent company. And this is super important. So if you go to California, for example, you're not going to have any. So if there's a question about which questions come up in business, you have questions about finance or product or support or sales, you basically have to wait a whole day to get a reply from the parent company. So you really just can't move at the speed of business or the speed of startups in the US if you're located on the West Coast. So if you're coming from the Nordics, you really want to make sure your company is located here on the East Coast. And, all the way from, if you can picture it, all the way from, New York, Boston area, Washington, D.C., Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, down to Miami, all really good options. And some of those have specific tech sector ecosystems built into them. The other thing you want to consider is, in the US, we're going to talk more about taxes later, is there's a federal income tax on corporate profits, but there's also a separate state income tax on profits. And these vary greatly from state to state. So we were recently talking with a company from the UK who is looking at coming to the US. They're a B2B marketplace, and they don't plan to add any employees in the US anytime soon. But their credit card processor, Stripe, came to them and said, hey, given the dollar volume that your company is doing in US dollars, we want you to set up a US entity to run those through instead of doing that through the UK entity. And I was talking with the CFO, and he said, well, gosh, our CEO has an apartment in New York City. I think we're just going to put our company there in New York City. And I said, well, you have to realize the variance of state income tax rate. So for example, in the state of New York State, the corporate income tax rate is 9.5%. But in North Carolina, it's 2.5%. So you can save 7 points of margin just by where you do your paperwork. So there's some variables like that you want to take into consideration. Also, access to talent. So if you're hiring tech talent here in the US, it's super competitive, and it's beneficial to be near pockets of tech talent. So there are pockets of certain geographies where you're going to find more tech talent than others. Again, much like we talked about before, Boston, New York, Northern Virginia around Washington, D.C., Research Triangle Park, Atlanta, Georgia, Miami, Florida. Proximity to customers and partners are somewhat important, but we don't weight that heavily because the U.S. is so large, it's kind of hard to comprehend how large it is. And just trying to move here to be close to a customer because of so many people now work remote. We have a company who moved their office to Arizona because they had a major partner there, but their partner manager lived in a different state altogether. So it's really hard to base your company around specific customers or partners from a geography standpoint. We do have one insurtech company who headquartered their company in Hartford, Connecticut, because that is the insurance capital of the U.S. So in that case, it's a pretty good way to do it. So another consideration, cost of living varies greatly in the U.S. As you can imagine, the larger cities are much more expensive and the rural areas are much less expensive, and there's some happy mediums in there. Another thing some people don't realize is the ease of travel, how important it is to be close to an international direct airport in the U.S. To travel inside the U.S. is pretty common because the country is so large, or to travel back and forth from the Nordics to the U.S. So you want to make sure you're near an international airport, so you don't have to take a two-step hop to every time you do want to get on an airplane if you're in a smaller market here in the U.S. So anyway, these are site selection criteria. On our website at usexpansionpartners.com, we have an interactive site selection tool. So if you go to the tab called Quiz, It'll take you through a series of 8 questions and then give you a market recommendation based on your inputs. So it's an easy way to kind of get an idea of markets that might be a fit for your company. So in the US, there are required insurances, and there are also additional coverages you may want to consider. In the US, you're going to have what's called general liability insurance, and you're going to have this to have an office, to do any kind of business, to run payroll in the US. So general liability or GL insurance will be required. It's not super expensive, but it's your basic layer of insurance for your corporation. When you have employees, you'll also be required to carry what's called workers' compensation insurance. This is insurance that's provided for the employees in case they're injured at work. It would give them some compensation while they're out. So these are both required to do business in the US. There's some additional coverages you're probably going to want to consider. The first one I usually tell people to make sure and do is what's called directors and officers insurance. When there's litigation in the US, it's most common that the corporation itself will be sued, and also the directors and officers will be sued. So I think a high priority insurance coverage would also be getting insurance for your directors and officers. This would be a policy that would cover their legal expenses if they're sued individually, which can happen. If you're in the tech space, which probably almost all of us are, you may have customers require you to have additional coverage to do business with them. So if you want to do business with a large US company, think Procter & Gamble or Coca-Cola or Ford Motor Company, they're probably going to require you to carry additional insurances if you're handling data. So the 2 most common are what's called errors and omissions, and also cyber and privacy. These policies can get very expensive, kind of depending on the business that you're in. But those are policies you're almost going to want to take a look at or be required to carry by your customers themselves. Another common insurance coverage here in the US is what's called employment practices. So if you were to get sued by an employee for some kind of HR infraction, whether it be illegal discrimination, et cetera, you'd have insurance kind of help cover those potential losses. And here in the US, the US government does not provide health insurance, and you may or may not be aware of this, for people unless they are live below the poverty line. So it's very common here in the US that health insurance is provided by the corporation, and that's not a cheap endeavor, but that's something if you're wanting to hire people here in the US, they're almost certainly going to expect that the company provide health insurance. So there's several options to consider. Again, the ones that are required are just general liability and workers' compensation, but depending on your situation, you're going to want to take a look at these other additional coverages to do business here as well. So we talked a little bit about taxes, but want to come back to this. So again, there's a federal tax system and there's a state tax system, and they sit on top of each other. So on the federal taxes, there is a tax on corporate income, on profits of 28%. There's also 2 payroll taxes. One is called the FICA tax, and that's a payroll tax that's taken out on the first $140,000 in income. And there's a federal unemployment tax, which is taken out on the first $8,000 in income. Then you also have state taxes to manage as well. So you have the state income tax, which would be on profits, state unemployment tax, which is a payroll tax. Sales tax in the US is very difficult and complex because you have different rules by state. So as you have either people or customers or sales in different states, or even travel to certain states, you may be required to pay sales tax on your business. And this is a pretty complicated system here in the US. There are services to help, but be aware of that. Business and property tax would be a local tax typically. So here where we're located, be handled by the local city. And then franchise tax. So in the case if you are a Delaware C corporation and you're not operating there, they're not collecting much tax on you, they'll charge you an annual tax to be a Delaware C corporation but operate somewhere else. It's called a franchise tax. If you're going to come to the US for an extended period of time to help set up your business, a lot of times you can come on a ESTA visa for a short period of time. There's some rules about what you can and can't do. But if you're going to send, which is pretty common, an executive from your company to spend a considerable amount of time setting up your US operations, you're going to need to get a visa, a US visa, to be here for 120 days or more. There are different types of visas, kind of depending on your level of investment or expertise here in the US, but just know that you're going to need a visa if you're going to be here for a considerable amount of time. If you're coming to the US, you're almost certainly going to want to do that. And there's actually attorneys who help with this process. It does take some time, and it is not inexpensive. You would probably be in the neighborhood of $10,000 or so to go through the entire visa process. but something you're going to have to plan for if you're going to be spending a considerable amount of time here in the US. So human resources, more than just a compliance standpoint. So here in the US, if you're wanting to attract talent, for example, it's very, very competitive. So one of the things human resources people think about a lot is making sure you have the right employee benefits in place. We talked earlier about how it's common that most US companies provide health insurance. There's also other benefits that go along with that. So 401k, which is a company-funded retirement plan, disability insurances, all these kinds of benefits that the company puts together are typically managed by the human resources department. And there'll be policies about how you treat people if they need to go on holiday or if they need to need to take time off. So all these things that kind of go into what I call getting the company talent ready to make sure your company's attractive to attract top talent for the US in form of benefits, policies, culture, all those things you're going to want to take in place. When you typically come to the US, you're typically going to start with just a handful of people, 2 or 3, before you scale up. Trying to get all these employee benefits and all these policies purchased as a small company is very difficult. And so there are organizations or services will put all your HR related technology and benefits all rolled into one service. So one's called Professional Employer Organization. This is an industry where you can get all of your HR services in one place. It makes it a little bit easier, get all these things up and running, and they will basically serve as your HR department for you when you're operating here in the US. Employee costs. So you may be aware, cost of just salaries in the US are quite a bit higher than probably most any place else in the world, especially in the tech industry. But on top of salaries, there's additional costs that you're going to need to consider and budget for. So there's taxes that go on top of the payroll. So we talked a little bit earlier about the federal unemployment tax. These come out of payroll the employer must pay at both the federal and state level. Also the Federal Insurance Contribution Act, or FICA. Both the employer and the employee pay 7.65% of their wages towards that. So, but the employer collects all these type of things. And again, these are going to vary by state. Where it gets very complex is the rules for the unemployment change as far as the amount of the tax and also the amount maximums of the tax by state. And so you'll have to have typically a software that manages that for you. But on top of the salaries and the required taxes, the other costs you're going to have to consider are the health insurance, the 401k, and it's also expected by most U.S. employees in the tech sector that they would have access to an employee stock option program, or ESOP. So that's an expectation almost everyone has here in the U.S. So in addition to salaries, these are the taxes you're going to need to budget for, and then also some of the additional costs around health insurance and 401k and ESOP. I want to talk a bit about go-to-market strategy. So I think a common mistake is when a company coming to the US has found or has good product market fit signals, they automatically make the assumption that they're going to have strong product market fit signals here in the US. And that could be a mistake. So a common mistake is coming to the US and overhiring for sales and marketing before you've really figured out product market fit. So you really want to think about coming to the US market as a brand new refresh of your company's launch, and start looking for those classic product market fit signals of, are customers buying, who's your competition, how are you positioning yourself in the marketplace itself, how are you going to price the company, how are you going to price your solution or product, what partners can you work with here in the US for distribution or influence, and what's your overall sales approach? Are you a top-down kind of enterprise sales? Are you a product-led growth? Are you direct consumer? So you're going to want to think about all these things in the U.S. market, like you're starting over again, to make sure you have a pretty good idea of how you're going to market here in the U.S. And I think a common mistake too is you really need to think about demand generation and how you're going to build awareness for your brand. I think there's a misperception is you can come to the U.S., you can hire a salesperson and they're going to make lots and lots of sales for you. I can't overemphasize how competitive the US market is, and trying to get the attention of decision makers or getting people to take a meeting or a phone call is very, very difficult. So as part of your US expansion and your go-to-market, you're going to have to be really thoughtful and put a lot of effort into your demand generation activities, marketing, and awareness, and just trying to get people to take a look at your brand. You're also going to need to make sure you have contracts that are ready for U.S. law and U.S. customers. So once you have your corporation here set up in the U.S., you're going to make sure you have your contracts converted to U.S. law. So it's something that your customers will be used to seeing. So these are the things you'll be thinking about when you do go to market. Now, the next piece we're going to do, IP, one more thing before we get into the fundraising. So when you come to the U.S., even if you have patents or trademarks in your home country, those are typically not applicable in the U.S., and you have to start again with that process. And so patents in the U.S. Typically are taken 12 to 15 months if you're in the consumer product space to get granted, and they can take up to 2 to 4 years in enterprise software space, depending on complexities. And in the U.S., one thing that's different is you must file for the U.S. patent within the first 12 months of the product being available. This is a very different point than how it works in a lot of countries. And it's really important that you do that. If you're going to file a patent, it must be done in the first 12 months. If you already have a patent in your home country, there are there's a Paris Convention Treaty and a patent cooperation treaty between several countries. The U.S. works with Europe in a lot of those. That makes it easier to apply. So you can kind of use your existing patent to apply here in the U.S. But again, it's a different process, and it does take a lot of time and a lot of money. Trademarks in the U.S. are handled a little bit differently. So the U.S. is what's called a use-based system. And what that means is your trademark or your brand has to be in the U.S. market and seen and available. So you can't just, if you have a trademark and you haven't launched in the U.S. Trademark Office will not grant you that mark until it's available. So you can't just trademark a name that you want to launch in the future. It has to actively be in use. So this is a little bit different system here in the U.S. And again, this is something that an intellectual property attorney would help you through. The trademark is about 2 years on average to get turned around. And I do want to say on both the patents and the trademarks, you're essentially protected from the file date. So it's not like, so in the case if you're filing a patent, it's not like you're not protected for the 2 to 4 years if you're in the enterprise software space. The date you apply is the date your protection starts if the software patent is granted, for example. So it starts on the day of filing, not the day it's granted. So those are the topics around U.S. expansion and kind of the basics there. So before we go into taking a little bit deeper dive on the on venture capital fundraising here in the U.S., just want to pause and see if anyone has immediate questions about the items we just talked about in the on the 12 steps, and we'll have time at the end. But if anyone has a burning question now, I'll be happy to take that before we jump into the next section. All right, so we're going to jump right into the venture capital fundraising. So,
sorry, I think there are some questions in the chat actually.
You know what? I have, because I'm on full screen, I can't see them.
Yeah.
Tanya, you want to translate for me what the questions are, and we'll handle it.
Oh, I can do that.
That'd be great.
Okay. So Monica asks that I heard a lot about a 401k as part of employees' benefit. Can you explain a bit more about this?
Yeah, so 401k, so much like health insurance in the U.S., the U.S. government doesn't really provide retirement benefits. It's a small amount, so it's really not enough if you're to retire on it if you're used to making a reasonable amount of money. So much like health insurance, employers often cover or have a program for retirement called a 401k, and it allows employees to deduct savings from their paychecks every month that go into an account. And what's nice about that is that money. So if, let's say you're going to save $500 a month into your savings account for retirement, that money comes out before taxes. So that gives you an incentive to save more money. It also reduces your tax liabilities. For companies, not only do they offer the program, but they can also offer to match, which is very common. More so for larger companies, a lot of startups don't do matching. So for example, there could be rules that my company will match 2% of my earnings into my 401k on my behalf. So it's a program that the company would want to set up. As a startup, you'd want to offer that. People expect it. It's not expensive to set up a 401k program. Employees can contribute to it on a pre-tax basis, so it's a benefit for them. The question becomes, from a budgeting standpoint, is does the company want to also contribute to that plan? Typically, early stage startups don't. Typically, later startups do. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Okay, and there's another question from Wendy. What is your opinion with making a business agreement with a US company to enter the US market instead of registering your own company in the US?
So I think as the question is, so if you want to do company business with, say, with Coca-Cola in Atlanta, would you need to register in the US, or could they do business directly with your company in your home country? Is that the question?
Let's assume so.
We'll go with that. Yeah, we'll go with that. So it really depends on the company. So some companies in the US are fine doing direct business with companies in other countries. That's not a problem. I would tell you their attorneys, and they all have a lot of attorneys, they would prefer to do business with a Delaware C corporation because they understand those rules of governance and legal protections very, very well. So it probably depends. Some companies are probably fine with it, and some may very well insist that they want to do business with a US C corporation. We have a client from Germany. They do a lot of business with Defense Department contractors here in the US, and they got a lot of pressure from their customers who are Defense Department contractors to set up a US entity because it was problematic for them to be doing business with a German company. So they wanted on paper to have a US company they are doing business with for a variety of reasons. So it kind of depends. Anything else, Tanya? Oh, sorry, you're on mute. Sorry.
Not in the chat, at least.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll have questions. Time for questions afterwards. So now we have our U.S. company set up. What's pretty common when companies come from Europe is they may raise money in their home market to get started, maybe some seed money, maybe an A round. But a lot of times when they want to raise later stage venture capital, they're going to look to the U.S. Market to do that. There's just a lot more venture capital firms, a lot more capital available. So this next section is going to be on, there's kind of 3 secrets to raising venture capital in the US. One is finding the right firm, one is finding the right partner, and one is finding an introduction to that right partner. So those are the topics we're going to talk through. And what you really want to think about in this first step is targeting the right venture capital firm. And the reason this is so important is there are thousands and thousands of venture capital firms in the US. And a lot of entrepreneurs all over the world chase the wrong venture capital firms, and they waste a lot of time and money and have a hard time with success when they chase the wrong firms. So what we're going to do today is take a deep dive into how to target the right firms and help you save all this time and money it's going to take during the fundraising process. Now, I think I'll start too by just saying that I think there's probably a misperception that raising venture capital in the US is easy. And it's very, very difficult. I think it's important to understand that here in the US with companies who have experienced teams and product market fit signals and revenue, the expectation is you're going to get 100 no's before you get your first term sheet. So I think there's a misperception when you want to raise venture capital in the US, you simply fly into San Francisco, you rent a convertible, you drive to Sand Hill Road in Palo Alto, and venture capitalists are lined up down the road to throw term sheets at you as you drive down the road. And it's much, much more complicated than that. So I want to kind of get you prepared for what that process looks like. There's some tools you're going to need to be successful in your venture capital fundraise. You probably already have a pitch deck if you're on this call. That's obviously a good starting point, but you don't want to make it 42 pages. You want to have an intro, a pretty quick intro pitch deck. Probably a product demo would be important. A really important step is a consolidated pro forma financial model. I think about that being your business or operating plans. You're going to have a pitch deck. It's going to be pretty high level. Once you have a consolidated pro forma model, it's going to have all your assumptions in there around headcount, cost, revenue. It would be when I say consolidated, it includes a income statement, a balance sheet. It would have a cash flow statement and have all your SaaS metrics kind of built into it. It's in its working model. That'd be a really important step. You're going to need some kind of Zoom or Teams like we're doing now, so you can kind of talk to people remotely, which actually is a good thing. It helps speed up a lot of the processes. Crunchbase, which is a venture capital database, is super important. LinkedIn Pro, we're going to come back to why that's so important here in a few minutes as we get into it. And then also having some kind of professional CRM system to manage the whole process, because it's such a large volume of people and contacts and processes you're going to talk to, is super helpful. Want to start talking about how venture capital works. And so I think it's important to understand how the economics of their industry works, so you can better understand their motivations and drivers themselves. So in that middle block there, if you're a venture capital firm, how this works is if I'm a general partner at a venture capital firm, I'm going to go out to what we call limited partners. So limited partners are high net worth individuals, university endowments, pension funds, or fund of funds. And I'm going to convince them to give me money to invest in our venture capital firm. Now, when I'm out raising money, the biggest objection I'm going to get is, gosh, David, why would I give my money to you and be exposed to all this risk in venture capital when I can just put my money in the S&P 500, which is an index fund here in the US, and over 10 years, I'm going to get 9.5% return. So why would I give my money to you and take on this risk when I can just get 9.5% in the S&P 500 and what's called an internal rate of return? And as a venture capitalist, I would say, oh, but Mr. Limited Partner, I have these really unique insights in this specific market segment. And let's just say it's e-commerce, women's fashion for teens. And because I have these unique insights and I know the business really well, and I have a great list of startups I can work with, I'm going to produce returns that are going to outperform the S&P 500 over 10 years. And so what happens is I convince those limited partners to give me money. I'm going to put it typically into a fund in the venture capital firm that's going to last 7 to 10 years. And how I make money as a venture capitalist is two ways. One, we charge a 2% management fee. So all the funds that we hold or have to invest, we charge a 2% management fee on that. We're going to invest those funds in startups. And those startups have exits. We're going to generate profits. When those profits are generated, my fund keeps 20%. We call that the carry. And I'm going to pass 80% of the profits back to the limited partners. And so the economics model of venture capital was called a 2 and 20 model. It's kind of a classic hedge fund. So a 2% management fee, 20% of the profits come to me. Now, you need to understand is, trying to outperform the S&P 500 over a 10-year period is really, really hard, right? Especially after I take out my 2% management fee and my 20% profits. That's an almost impossible task, honestly. Very few funds can pull off over the long period. So it's important to understand as an entrepreneur, the general partners at the venture capital firms, they don't wake up in the morning and think, gosh, I wish I could find a really innovative, cool startup to invest in today. They wake up in the morning and think, oh, dear God, how in the world am I going to outperform the S&P 500 and provide a return to these people I've promised them that I'm going to provide them? So they're essentially finance people trying to give a return to partners more so than startup people. So keep that in mind. Is their overall drivers are how to provide a return, not to fund your startup. That's the overall thing they think about 24/7. Now, in a venture capital firm, you're going to hear lots of different roles or titles, and it's really important to understand these. So there's a couple people you might hear about title-wise that don't have any decision-making capabilities. So if someone is a limited partner at a venture capital firm, they're not involved with the firm. They're simply an investor. So they don't have any say-so in the investment. They might be able to help with introductions to the firm, but they're not really actively involved in decision-making there. There are typically two really important meetings you need to be aware of in the process of raising venture capital. Typically, when people who work at a venture capital firm, during the week, they're going to talk to lots of startups. And typically on Mondays, all those people get together in a room and decide which startups they're going to look at more closely. So there's typically a Monday morning meeting where the people who sit in that room, and it could be partners, general partners almost certainly, sometimes principals and associates can bring deals to the table, but there's the people in that room will make a decision of, hey, are we going to go further and look at this company? Here's some companies we looked at, we want to talk about. They'll pitch them internally, and if they get the go-ahead, they'll move forward with the process. So that Monday morning meeting is real important. And later, in the more serious part, once you kind of get through the whole process, there'll be a formal investment committee meeting where they make a go, no-go decision on your investment. And so what you really need to know is, as a entrepreneur who's going through the venture capital process, when you're talking to someone, their title doesn't really matter. What really matters is you want to make sure you're talking directly to somebody who is on that Monday meeting where they go through deal flow. And then ultimately, you're going to make sure you have a relationship with somebody who sits on the investment committee who can represent your interests there. So again, not super important what the titles are. There's a lot of debate here in the US of an analyst or an associate calls you and wants to talk to you. What's their job? They look for deal flow. Should you waste your time, quote unquote, waste your time talking to somebody who's not a partner? I'm not sure there's a right or wrong answer on that, but I think the more important thing is you want to make sure the people you're talking to can represent you in the Monday meeting and then ultimately in the investment committee meeting. And so it's okay, probably in my opinion, to start with somebody who's an associate just doing due diligence if you don't have a good intro there. But you always want to be mindful of, hey, how can we talk to your partner? How can we talk to a partner who sits on the investment committee when you're going through the process? Another role at VC firms you may hear is entrepreneur in residence. And so this is typically somebody from their portfolio company who's had an exit, doesn't know what they're going to do next. So they'll come and actually essentially hang out in the venture capital firm, help with portfolio companies, look at deal flow, but they don't have any decision-making capabilities. So just keep in mind, if you're talking to someone who's a limited partner, entrepreneur in residence, they're really not in a position to help you with the process, but they might be able to help you with introductions to people who are in the decision-making process. All right, so this is kind of the most important slide of the whole deck. And so when you are, because there's thousands and thousands of US firms, venture capital firms here in the US, the secret kind of first step for you to be successful in this is identifying the right firms who are going to be interested in investing in your company. What I mean by that is, when I'm a general partner at a venture capital firm and I'm going out to raise money, keep in mind, I'm going to go out and pitch my investors with a very specific investment theme. This is how I'm going to outperform the S&P 500. And it may be, we're going to specialize in developer op tools and in B round. And maybe we're going to specialize in seed round clean tech. But they're typically going to go out and pitch a very specific investment thesis. And that's going to be around the stage. It's going to be around specific tech themes, geographies, all these kind of things. And so the secret is really, you just want to do your homework as an entrepreneur and find the funds who have investment themes that align with exactly what your company does in your stage. So it sounds kind of basic, and we're going to talk about how to do that. But the things you want to do, you want to qualify investors that you're going to talk to on your side first. And so the things you want to look at is the stage of the company that they're investing in. So if you're a seed stage company, and this is a growth equity company, probably not a fit. Tech themes, they probably have specific tech themes they invest in. Again, if you're in clean tech and you want to find clean tech funds. Geography is really important, especially if you're coming from the Nordics. So certain US funds have investment theses where they're only going to invest in US companies. Some are happy to invest in Finland or Norway. So you want to make sure you understand the geography where companies invest. And because you don't want to talk to companies, you don't talk to venture capital firms or waste cycles trying to talk to firms who don't align with your stage, your theme, and your geography, because then you're wasting a lot of time. Another thing that's really important in your investor qualifying criteria right now is raising venture capital as an entrepreneur is hard, but also raising venture capital as a general partner at a venture capital firm is really hard. And so there's a lot of funds you're going to find more and more here over the next year who don't have any new capital to invest. So after they've raised their last cycle, they have not been successful in raising a new fund because they couldn't produce the returns that limited partners wants. So they still exist because they have a portfolio of companies and they still get their 2% management fee and they're still getting their 20% carry on any kind of exits in their portfolio company, but they simply don't have any new capital to invest. And be careful, because these people will take meetings, take your time, and waste a lot of time. If they don't have any fresh capital to invest, don't waste your time talking to them, because they don't have any money to invest in you. So one of the things you want to look at is, when you're doing your selection criteria, is the date of their last investment. If this fund you're thinking about has not written a check in, say, the last 6 to 8 months, they probably don't have any money. And so you want to be very wary of spending time with them. You also want to understand the typical size of the fund. And we'll talk about, because the size of the fund is directly related to the IRR or return for the fund and how big it has to go for. You also want to be aware of, do they have any competitive portfolio companies? Because if a company, some funds have very specific rules around not investing in more than one company in the segment, and some don't, but you want to understand that. And also just be aware of, anytime you share your deck or financials with a venture capital firm who has competing portfolio companies, rest assured that that information is going to almost certainly find their way to that company. And then you also want to see the kind of the local regional investment. So funds who are actively investing in companies in Finland, for example, will probably be interested in investing in you. So these are the criteria you want to think about when you're trying to think about how to narrow that field of thousands and thousands of VC firms down to the ones who most likely be interested in investing in your company. A really great tool for doing this research is what's called Crunchbase. There's at least two that I know of, venture capital databases here in the US. One's called Crunchbase, one is called PitchBook, and they basically are a database of venture capital firms and deal flow. So you can actually go in and look up companies, venture capital funds that are investing in certain stages, tech themes, what kind of size check, what geography they're investing in. So you can essentially use this to do the work for your research to trying to sort the companies you want to talk to. It's also a really important tool for doing competitive research. You can see how much money your competitors have raised. You can set up alerts for events or things that are happening around the region. And so what you really want to do is use Crunchbase to create your target list of venture funds you want to talk to. So this is an example of the Crunchbase UI for search. It looks like it's something straight out of the 90s because it probably is straight out of the 90s. So it's not pretty, but it has good data. And so you'll see here our search criteria. We have an example here where we are going to be a DevOps company from the UK trying to raise a $20 million B round of funding. So this is who we are in our company. So we're going to look for headquarters locations. We're going to look for venture capital firms based in the US. They're in venture capital, that they do actively invest in the UK and Europe. Again, some funds don't, so you want to know that those are the ones you want to target. You can also look up by industry. So you can look up developer platform or developer tools. They might not have exactly your category, but you'll find something close. Again, ABC series, at least $10 million. So this is the selection criteria we're going to put in to Crunchbase to try and find the list of firms we're going to want to talk to. And once I hit this, I'm going to get a list of hundreds, if not thousands, of venture firms that fit these criteria. And what I'll do is I will go to, and this is just one that shows up, Lightspeed Venture Partners. So then I'll go to Lightspeed Venture Partners page on Crunchbase. I can look and see that they invest in enterprise technology, software, and IT and enterprise software. They're top 3 categories where they invest. So this looks like a pretty good fit for our company, our DevOps company, trying to raise a $20 million round. So now I'll actually go in and dig a little deeper and look at their portfolio investments. And I'm going to see some really important things here. So I'm going to see, looking at dates, that they are actively writing checks. So again, they're not a zombie fund. They're actively writing checks. You can see here regularly. They lead. So this is a really important topic when you start talking to venture capital firms. As an entrepreneur, it's super frustrating. You'll talk to a lot of funds who will say, oh, we're really interested. When you find a lead investor, let us know. We'd be interested in talking more. So you're really going to have to work extra hard to find someone not only who will invest, but there's someone who will lead. And the reason that some funds don't lead is that the lead typically sets the investment terms. They typically do the due diligence, and they typically take their responsibilities of being on the board. So your ideal person is going to be companies who actually lead investments. So we're going to see they're actively investing. They are lead investors, and they definitely invest. If you kind of look down the right-hand column, they definitely invest in $20 million rounds. So this looks like, kind of based on our selection criteria in our example DevOps tool, this looks like the right fund for us to talk to. So now, again, step 1 is to identify the right fund. Step 2 is to identify the right partner within the fund. And so what I would do is go to the Lightspeed website, and they'll list all their partners. And what you're going to find, especially with the larger funds like this one, they're going to have partners who have specialty topics where they invest. And so the second step is find the right fund. And now you want to find the right partner within the fund. So I would go through all the partners' bio pages on their website, and you kind of find out what their specialties are. So here on Lightspeed, again, on our DevOps company from UK trying to raise $20 million, we can see Guru's specialties are DevOps, cloud infrastructure, ops tools. So it certainly sounds like this is the right person for us. You'll notice here, and this is a really important piece, you can see the other investments that Guru's made, and we're going to come back and talk about that in just a minute, right? So now that we know who the right firm is that we want to target, which is Lightspeed, and we know the right person who's Guru, the next step, and this is the most important and the hardest, is to try and find a personal introduction to Guru, right? So this is kind of an unspoken thing, especially for the tier 1 firms. There's kind of an unspoken adage that if an entrepreneur is not savvy enough to get a personal introduction to me as a partner at a venture firm, they're probably not savvy enough to hire top employees. They're probably not savvy enough to close top customers, and they're ultimately probably not savvy enough to be successful. So getting that personal introduction is really, really important. It's also really, really hard, especially if you're coming from Europe and you don't have a good network here in the US. So we're going to talk about ways you can find introductions to your target partners. This is an important part of the process. LinkedIn is a fantastic tool for this. So I would pull up Guru here on LinkedIn. A lot of times from the partner page, they'll have a link. And I'll go to Guru's page. There's a couple of things going to be super important to kind of trying to find a path for an introduction into this particular person. Fortunately for me, I have a pretty good network here in the US. I know 12 people who are connections with Guru. So this would be the easiest path. If I can go to one of the people I already know and ask them, hey, do you know Guru? Could you introduce us? Great. That's the easiest path. You may or may not have mutual connections, but this is always a great way to build out your network. This is a good starting point. The other thing I would notice is that Guru went to Purdue University. And so I know, for example, the CFO at my last company also went to Purdue University. A lot of universities have alumni directory where they can message each other. So I could go back to my friend or former coworker who used to go to school at Purdue and see if he has an avenue to reach Guru. I can also see where he worked at a startup called Avi and a startup called Nuva. Can I go back to those companies and try and find people I might know at those companies who could introduce us? So now this becomes, how creative can you get to trying to find a way to find an introduction to Guru? So this is kind of the biggest challenge. But if you can find a personal introduction, your chances of success are so much greater. It's really hard to comprehend the amount of inbound email and cold pitches someone at a top tier venture fund like Lightspeed gets. I don't know Guru, but I'm sure he gets hundreds, probably a week, if not a day, of inbounds. And so when you have a personal introduction, that goes to the top of the box, and they'll pay attention to that more than all the cold inbounds in their inbox, I promise. So now we identify Guru. How can we find an introduction? So we talked about LinkedIn, we talked about university. The next thing you can do, if you kind of strike out on the LinkedIn connections and university networks, you can go back to, you can go back to their portfolio page of the companies where they invested and start the process over. So you go back to a portfolio company, go look at those executive teams, see if you can find an intro to the other founder. If you're a founder at a company, if you reach out to a founder at another company, even if you haven't met them before, you'd be surprised how often they're willing to help. So the next avenue, if you can't find a tier one way into to meet this person, go back to the portfolio companies, go to the founders of those companies and see if you can find an introduction to them. If you can't, doing cold outreach to them is not a bad way to go. Hey, I'm in the space. I see the Guru is invested in your company. I believe he likes us for these following reasons. Would you be up for introducing us? So that's another path to go. Another way to think about this, another avenue, is through certain service providers. So here in the US, there are certain law firms who have very good connections with venture capital firms. There are certain CPA firms who have very good connections, certain insurance providers. So using service providers in your network to help with introductions is also another avenue. Now, the technique I've developed over time for asking for introductions is as follows. And I would reach out to that person, probably if I know them well, reach out to them on text, say, hey, do you know Guru at Lightspeed well enough to introduce us? If so, I'll send you a separate email that you can easily forward along. If not, no problem, right? And the reason I take that approach is what you're going to find is you're going to ask for favors from the same group of people over and over and over. And you'll start wearing out your welcome. So you want to make it super easy for them, to help. So if they are interested in helping, instead of them having to write an email and figure out who you are and why you want to talk to them, create it for them and send it to them so they can just forward it on. And if they don't know them well, say, no problem, no worries. I appreciate your considering us, because you're going to come back and ask that person for another introduction, almost certainly at another time. So again, reach out to that person if you have a common introduction. It could be in any of these ways, but once you find someone, hey, do you know them well enough to help? If so, I'll send you an email you can forward along with some background information. If not, no worries. So when you get your first meeting, a lot of times, especially now, these would be remote meetings, so probably on Zoom or Teams. And so I would probably always think about budgeting 30 minutes for the intro meeting. And I want you to be aware of that time frame, because what happens a lot of times, people get really excited when they get their first pitch meeting with a venture capital firm, and they talk about how great their company is for the whole 30 minutes, and then the meeting's over. You really want to get to where you're engaging with this person and getting to know them. The relationship between the venture capital firm and the founder is super important. So if you spend that whole 30 minutes just talking nonstop about your company, you're never going to build rapport. You're not going to be doing yourself any favors. So I would typically start the meeting asking some open-ended questions. Now, these are things you're probably going to know, but it also makes you sound like you understand the industry. If you say, hey, tell me about your firm. What's your current life cycle? What's your average size check? Do you typically lead? Get them talking about their firm themselves. Hey, why did you get into VC? What is your specific investment thesis or focus? Get them talking about that. Really, really important. The next things you want to ask is, what's your investment decision-making process? And it's almost certainly going to be, we have a meeting on Mondays where we review deals, and then there's an investment committee. So you understand what those two meetings are. And I would also ask about the timing of the investment committee meetings. So those are kind of qualifying questions. You probably spend about 5 minutes on that. I would do your pitch in less than 10 minutes, which is hard, but you want to do your pitch. And all you're really trying to do in this first meeting is get them interested enough to go further. So if you basically do your pitch and then have half your time, whatever the time allocated is, just to talk and let them ask questions about your company, about your background, those type of things. So don't talk about your company the whole time. Make sure you actually have a conversation when you get that actual first meeting. All right. So now you've had your first meeting. There's a couple important best practices for managing this. The first, as we talked about it a little bit earlier, is creating an investor CRM. Again, you're going to have to get 100 no's. And to get 100 no's, you're probably going to have to do outreach to hundreds and hundreds of firms to get to 100 no's. So setting up a separate CRM system just to track all your activities, your contacts, your emails, and to manage a pipeline is super important. And you're also going to do a monthly investor newsletter. This is a great way for an essentially lead nurturing campaign where you're going to keep your brand in front of these investors once a month on an ongoing basis. And we're going to dig into some of these best practices just a little bit more now. In the CRM system, one of the things that's really important is creating a pipeline management, much like you would in enterprise sales, as far as understanding where you are with your venture capital raise. A lot of the venture capital people you're talking to are super charming, and you're going to think, oh my gosh, this went so well. They love me, and they're definitely going to write me a check, only to be disappointed that you never hear from them again. So I think it's really important that you start creating a pipeline management with very measurable, specific steps to see if you're making forward progress. So the steps I would typically do is, did I get an introduction? Did I actually get to somebody introduce us? Did I get a pitch meeting with them? Have they seen a product demo? Have they asked for a pro forma? Have they taken us to the investment committee? Did we get a term sheet? So those are all very measurable, distinct steps. And it also helps you better understand where you are with each of these funds. It also helps you communicate to your team and to your existing investors where you are in the process. So it's not just, hey, it feels really good. They really like this. I'm sure they're going to invest. You can actually have measurable steps that you can manage all the way. And then you can start thinking about, once you're at one step, how do you get that venture fund to the next step, into the next step? So it basically becomes B2B sales pipeline management from the venture space. Now, the other thing I found to be super helpful over time is to create a discipline around doing a monthly investor newsletter. This is a really important step because you want to keep your name and your company in front of these investors on an ongoing basis. And so every investor I talk to, a trial close or kind of get a soft commitment from them would be, hey, we publish a monthly investor newsletter. Would you be interested in subscribing to that? You always want to ask. You don't ever spam the venture capital community. Always ask. Most of the time, if they're interested in all, they'll say, yes, put me on your list. And you're going to send a monthly newsletter just as an update. And the format I've become accustomed to that I've had a lot of success with is basically 3 pieces to the newsletter. Again, the people in the venture capital community receive hundreds or thousands of emails. The volume's hard to comprehend. And so what they don't do is they don't read long text. And so a lot of entrepreneurs do is they write in great prose about how great their company is doing. Nobody's going to read that. So what I've developed is kind of a 3-step process to make it really simple for them to digest. There's going to be a section that says, here's the good news. And I'm going to have 3 bullet points. And I'm going to have them be very, very specific and measurable. So it's not like, hey, we had a great meeting. We feel really good about this. Something that's measurable, some kind of quantitative thing. So in this case, we've exceeded 500 monthly paying subscribers. We grew at greater than 10%. We've made an important hire, right? So these are good news, very specific things. Equally important, now this gives a lot of entrepreneurs discomfort. I got to where I would share bad news. This is also equally important because venture capitalists are used to entrepreneurs blowing sunshine at them the whole time. And if you really understand your business, and they all know this, everyone who's ever been an entrepreneur knows this, there's all kinds of terrible things that happen and bad things that happen in a startup. And so what you really want to demonstrate is that you understand the business, you understand your challenges, and you know how to address it. So much like the good news, I would include a bad news section, and I make it very quantitative and easy to read. So in bullet points. So we had a top 10 customer churn, right? This is terrible, but this has happened, right? Our website traffic was down. Our campaign did not do well. So again, you want to demonstrate, it's not that you want to think it's only good news to your business. You want to demonstrate you understand your business, because everyone understands there's good and bad. The last section I have started adding, or I've added historically, is a section on how you can help. And you'd be amazed when you have a specific ask, how people who you never thought would be able to help you would be able to help you. My favorite example of this is, several companies ago, Amazon launched their Alexa fund. It's a $100 million venture fund. And there was one person who was basically the managing director for this. And I could not find an introduction to this person anywhere. And I got a pretty good network. I just struck out everywhere. So I put it in my investor newsletter. Hey, I'm trying to connect with this managing partner, and I can't remember his name at the top of my head, at the Alexa fund for Amazon. If anyone knows him, I would appreciate an introduction. I actually got an inbound back from somebody who was in my business school class, and I don't even know why he was in my newsletter, who said, hey, my college undergrad roommate from Duke actually rents his house in Seattle to that guy who manages the Alexa fund. I'd be happy to introduce you to him. So here is somebody who was not even in the venture capital community, who was in my MBA program, whose college undergrad roommate rents the guy I'm trying to talk to a house. And he actually did the intro for me. So I didn't get the deal, but I got to talk to the guy, which is an important piece. So I always ask how you could help. How you could help could be a specific introduction. It could be a specific hire you're trying to make. It could be a specific partner you're trying to connect with, or a specific contact at a customer. So again, really specific ask, and you'd be surprised how often it works. But I think the key is you have to have real discipline around this and do this regularly. You can't do it some months and not. The other thing that's nice, if you use a professional CRM tool, like I use HubSpot a lot, you can also see who opens your emails and who forwards your emails, which is also another way when you have investors of seeing what their interest level is. So if you see people who are regularly reading your emails, they're probably interested. If you see people who aren't, it also tells you probably not. But you can also see when they start forwarding your emails around to other people. So just another way of trying to engage interest from potential investors. Want to talk a little bit about valuations of companies, especially when you're talking to professional investors here in the US. In early stage companies, I'm sure in your regions and here in the US, there is much gnashing of teeth around what is the pre-money valuation of your startup. And the reality of it is, for anyone who's been around venture investing for a long time, is that there is no rational valuation tool or metric or methodology for a pre-revenue company, right? There's no such thing as a discounted cash flow model that's rational at all. And so in early stage, when you're trying to raise your first rounds of capital, there's a lot of people talking about what's your pre-money, how do you justify this, what's your post-money? It's just lots of energy and lots of effort and lots of wasted time, frankly, put into that. When you move up to professional investors, what I found is they don't put any effort into that at all. When they go out with professional venture capital investors, and again, I have my investment thesis, I'm the general partner, they typically are looking to take 20% equity to 30% equity in a given round. That's their math model, right? That's how their financial model works. And so if you are, for example, and we're trying to raise a $20 million B round as a DevOps company, if we're going to be diluted 20% on the round, which is what the venture capital firm is looking for, and I'm raising $20 million, the pre and post money are just a plug, right? It's just math. So what I mean by that is, if I know I'm going to be diluted 20% and I'm raising $20 million, the pre-money valuation has to be $80 million. The post-money valuation has to be $100 million. The pre-money plus the investment, that's your post-money. It's just a plug, right? And so how you translate that down, if you're raising $5 million and you're going to be diluted 20%, your pre-money valuation is $20 million. And your post-money valuation is $25 million. It's just a plug. It's just math. So what I found with professional investors, maybe who work at venture capital firms, anytime I would get the question is, what's your pre-money valuation? I would simply answer, we're expected to be diluted 20% on the round. And that's the end of that conversation. That's what they want, and we just move on. There is no, how do you justify this, or how do you justify your pre-money, or what comps do you have? We're going to be diluted 20% on the round. Move on to the next topic. So anyway, That's also, as an entrepreneur, that's how I've grown to qualify or sort investors. So if an investor asks me, hey, what's your pre-money valuation? And I would say, hey, we expect to be diluted 20% on the round. If they want to dig into what that means, that really tells me they don't really understand the business like they should, right? So that's how I qualify investors a lot of times too. So I just want to share that with you because there is just so much, like I said, gnashing of teeth and wasted time spent, talking about what's your pre-money when there is absolutely no rational methodology for valuing an early stage company. All right, so I want to set up so here's a few US VC related topics I want to talk through that I think are important. This is kind of some cultural things and kind of some things you need to be aware of. We talked about this earlier, but I can't emphasize enough. You need to expect to pitch more than 100 investors before you get your first term sheet. And that's really important because it's going to take you, this process we just went through, it's a ton of work. It takes a ton of time. So it's going to take you at least 6 months to do this, even if you're doing it full time. So make sure you have enough runway. If you're going out to raise cash, you're going out to raise professional money with 30 days of runway, you're not going to have enough time to do it. Just understand it's going to take 100 or more pitches to get a term sheet on average. In the US, professional investors do not sign non-disclosure agreements. Don't ask them to. You're not going to be the exception. They aren't going to do it. So just don't ask. They see so much deal flow, they can't keep up with that process. One lesson I learned is, again, you have to ask, you're going to find lots of people you're going to try and find to ask for introductions. And the venture capital community, even though it's very large in the US, is very small in some ways, and they largely know each other. But one thing I've learned you don't want to do is, once you have an investor tell you no, you don't go back to that person and ask them for an introduction to another investor. Because the first question they're going to get is, well, if they're so great, why didn't you invest in them? So that's just a bad avenue I've learned just from personal experience. So investor tells you no, if you go to LinkedIn and you see that you connected with them and they know somebody else you want to meet, they're not the right person to ask for an introduction. The lead investor is going to ask for a seat on your board of directors. This is kind of the expectation. One always kind of nasty, disappointing surprise is you will get an invoice to pay the fees, legal fees of your venture capital firm in the mail. So the expectation is that you're going to pay the investment firm's legal fees. Now, ultimately, you have their money, so I guess that makes sense. But it always just kind of bothered me as a founder that I had to pay their legal fees and ours. But anyway, so that should be an expectation that you have. Probably the most emotional, difficult topic when it comes to venture capital in the US is when you get that term sheet. When you finally get to that point, there's going to be a stipulation in there saying that the founders have to revest their shares. And so I came into a company, partnered with a founder a few years back who had already been working at his company for 4 years, who'd already personally invested hundreds of thousands of dollars of his own money into the business. And when we got our first term sheet, it stipulated that he had to revest all of his shares from scratch, even though he'd already put hundreds of thousands of dollars into the business and already been at it for 4 years. There's ways to mitigate that, but just know that is a standard term in the term sheet that's going to come. And the expectations from the VC side is, look, we're investing in this team, not the product. And what we don't want to do is put money into this team and then the founder goes off to do their next thing. We want to make sure that you're along for the ride with us. Again, super emotional as a founder. I hate that. Just so you know, that's going to be in there and that's going to be the expectation. And there's ways to opt out of it. You can't opt out of it, but there's ways to mitigate it. So I always do things like have side letters to where if I'm the founder and I get terminated without cause, all my options or shares vest automatically 100%. If we get acquired or if there's change of control more than 51%, my shares would vest automatically. So there's some ways to get around that. But just know that's going to be there. One other thing that's different from the US and Europe I found is finder's fees. So in the US, finder's fees are largely a no-no. And for two reasons. Number one is the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates securities in the US, views finder's fees for conducting a VC to a startup as selling equities. And you can't sell stock or equities in the US unless you're licensed, what's called a licensed broker dealer. So you may find people who come and say, hey, I'll introduce you to these firms. I know all these firms, I'll introduce you, but I need a cut of the deal. So unless they are a licensed broker dealer, that would be a violation of US law. And so frankly, there are lots of shady people out there who are trying to, find a way to make easy money. And they might know some people in venture capital, and they run around saying, hey, I can introduce you to these VCs, but I'm going to need some money to do so. I want 2% of the deal. Easiest way to diffuse that is ask them, hey, do you have a broker-dealer license? And most of the time they'll say no. And then the answer is then no, if they don't have a broker-dealer license. The other part of that logic of no finder's fees is the top tier venture funds in the US, they don't need deal flow. They have everyone on the planet trying to kick their doors down. And so when they make an investment, they want 100% of their capital going into the growth of your company. They don't want 1 or 2 or 5% of that money going to some middle person who made an introduction. So finder's fees, I think, are pretty common in the US. In Europe, there's people who actually do connections and they make a deal on that side. In the US, because of the Securities and Exchange rules and also the general mindset of the US VCs is it happens sometimes, but it's a rarity. And one tip, if you really want to learn about the venture capital community, a lot of these people, these partners you want to talk to, a lot of them are on Twitter, or X, I guess now as you call it. So I actually have a separate channel I've set up on Twitter where I just follow different VCs, and I kind of look at that on a daily basis, see what they're talking about, what they're interested in, and what they're doing. So that's just kind of one way I kind of keep an idea of what's going on in the venture community. So these are a couple of recommended resources. These are books. So Venture Deal, Startup CEO, and Startup Boards are all fantastic. There's a couple of really good blogs I like. I think my favorite is Mark Seuster's Both Sides of the Table. He was a 3-time entrepreneur who now is a general partner at Upfront Ventures in Los Angeles. And there's a couple of podcasts that I like. So these are good resources. And this is my contact information. So if you have questions, if you want to connect, if you want to reach out on LinkedIn, all I would ask is, I consider us all friends now, but I only typically accept LinkedIn requests from people I know. So if you reach out to me on LinkedIn to say, hey, good meeting you on the Tech Nordic Advocates webinar today, just so I know that I already know you when you do that. So here's my contact information. I'm going to stop my sharing my screen here so I can actually see the chat questions. So Tanya doesn't have to navigate for me. And I'm going to pause here. So we covered a lot of ground on launching in the US and raising venture capital. So we'll happy to take your questions here.
I actually have a question right away.
Well, you get to go first because you were so helpful earlier.
So, first of all, this was amazing. It was like a crash course on expanding to the US, and then also the whole investor side and everything to look out for. As a marketer, I particularly love the newsletter, like for investors, such a smart and like effective idea. So my question is more about the VC firms. So concrete example. So I offer CMO as a service. I've been doing this for the last 5 years. And one way is how I got customers was through private equity and venture capital firms, because they have their portfolio companies. And very often they want those companies to have like go-to-market strategies, expand to other countries, whatever it is. And then they referred me and my company to those portfolio companies, and then either I took the gig or then somebody I knew. So you had this really insightful list on the different roles and titles in a VC firm. So if you would be me, and I would love to have like a partnership with a VC firm, and so they would recommend me to their portfolio companies, who is the person I should contact? Like, who is the person that is most likely to respond to that? Because as you said, people get a lot of emails.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the ideal person and who you should are probably two different answers. So the ideal person, the person who essentially runs the firm or any venture capital firm, is typically called the general partner. If they're a general partner, they are the decision maker, right? But like I like to network with venture capital firms too, but I understand the general partner, I don't really add any value to their day, right? They're interested in raising capital from limited partners, and they're interested in making sure they have portfolio companies that are moving to exit. So as a partner or service provider of venture capital firm, I'd love to talk to the general partner, but they probably aren't super interested in talking to me because they have other priorities. And so I think there's typically going to be somebody within the organization who is responsible for portfolio management. And that could be somewhere in the talent organization or they actually call portfolio management. And those are people who want to make sure they're trying to get resources and help their portfolio companies be successful. So not all firms have somebody in charge of that. The larger ones do. So somebody who just thinks 24 hours, like how can we bring resources to our portfolio companies? And so that would be the right person. They have weird titles, right? So sometimes it's going to be like, I know I talked to a person in that role at a VC fund in Dublin a couple of weeks ago, and her title was like head of marketing, but her job is portfolio management. And so it's not necessarily an easy one to find. But I hope I didn't really answer your question. So ideally, you talk to the general partner. They're probably not super interested in talking with you, but if you can find the person in the firm who's responsible for portfolio management, and sometimes the individual partners do that, and sometimes there's an individual person that does that, but that'd be the best avenue, because that's the one I think about a lot myself.
Okay, well, thanks. That was really helpful.
I hope that helps. What other questions?
So
anything about the U.S. market or venture
now
capital?
That we have everyone's attention, I'd like to see if we can have everyone turn on their camera again, so we can take a group picture, just a 1 minute group picture break. So I will try and get a gallery showing here, and I can see that there's more and more people that are turning on their camera. And the hair looks good. Mine is the same.
It does look fabulous. I love that haircut.
Yes. So, David, I see we have the same hairdresser. I
love that.
Be a great picture. And I will take say smile, everyone. There we go. So sorry for pulling in a Kodak moment here in the middle of a great and informative workshop. We were looking at chat questions, or we have Belma. She has a question. Raise her hand.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I've learned definitely a lot. We are just now starting to look at the US market, and there are details that I would never think of, and I guess that's why we are here. But something that raised up to me when you were talking about some good practices that we can do in terms of building relationships with the investors that require actually marketing efforts. They require a lot of more elaborate strategies if you're talking about newsletters, getting to the emails and similar, and having a marketing person for that, which is not the case for a lot of us, I think. So how would you come around that? Is going around newsletters possible until we get to a certain point? Or how would you update the investors in case you don't have that, for example, as an option?
Yeah, great question. I think you're not going to like the answer, Belma, because it's really up to you. It's the founder. The founder is actually the only person who can fundraise, and so I think a lot of founders want to think about product and think about customers and those kind of things, but it's really this is a process that only the founder can do, because the venture capital firm is not interested, honestly, just being frank. They're not interested in really building a relationship with anybody else in your company. They want to know you, the founder. They want to build a relationship with you. And that kind of starts with all that outreach. So when you start doing homework on an individual investor, and again, it takes tons and tons of time. When you go look at their LinkedIn, you follow them on Twitter, you go follow their blog, all those learnings become really, really important, because you're understanding them and what they're interested in. And so I think a lot of that research, you could probably get some baseline research. You could probably hire an intern to say, we want you to go to Crunchbase, and these are our selection criteria. We want you to pull that list. But, and if you can train them, if they're good, you train them how to go find the right partners. But then you're going to need to start doing your own homework, and you need to do your own outreach. And it takes a ton of time. It's one of those classic catch-22s of being a startup CEO, in that only you can fundraise, but you have to have success metrics with revenue and customers to get them to pay attention, which you have to, invest in your marketing of the firm, and you have to have great product to do that. And so this is one of those terrible kind of startup dilemmas, founder dilemmas, where only you can fundraise, but you have to have great results to get attention, and the outreach is hard. So I wish I had an easy answer for you, other than the fact that it's really hard, but lots of people are successful at it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That helped.
I don't help, but I think that's where we all are. Yeah.
Confirm the confusion and like the chicken and egg problem, which is like, do we have to be successful to raise? Because there's a lot of people asking for a lot of traction for very early stage startups at the moment, and it's frightening, to be honest.
Right. Yeah, and honestly, that's a word you said right there always triggers me. So like, just from, like I said, I've done hundreds of A-round venture raises. More traction is a trigger word for me, because that's a soft no, right? But it's not really a no. Like, hey, what's super interesting? We want to see some more traction. We want to talk more. That doesn't. What does that mean? Like, does that mean 10 more customers, 2 more customers? And so, like, more traction is a term you're going to hear a lot. But again, it triggers me because it doesn't mean anything. But you don't get a yes or no. I'd really just say no, you're not a fit, and I'll move on. Versus, we want to see more traction, which in my history means they're not going to write a check anyway. But that's what's nice about the newsletter, because you can just kind of keep your brand in front of them, keep them updated, but you don't have to waste more cycles on them. So I think I talk to every single investor I talk to, I'm like, hey, would you want to be on our newsletter? And I put them on there until they unsubscribe, and just kind of keep our brand in front of them.
Thanks.
Sure. Karen.
Hi, thank you so much for this very insightful presentation. I have mainly 2 questions regarding the VCs. One thing that I have found here in Finland is that when talking to different VCs and everything, that they are very industry oriented. Like, if you don't fall within their industry, they would say just a hard no. That's one. So what is the situation in the US with investors? Are they more open to different industries? Are there more like, if they like the business plan or the financial plan, what is that attracts them the most? And the other question, when we have been, because of the same situation that we have found here in Finland, that are very industry oriented, is that we have started to look for international investors. The ones that I have found that are mostly investing in the area in which I am, which is chemistry, or this biomedical chemistry. What I have found is that the people who have invested in the US, they're limited only to the US. So what are the chances of finding investors that do actually invest outside of, if you're still not inside the US market?
Yeah, great question. So let's kind of take those in 2. So the first question is, okay, I'm trying to pitch this firm, but they're only investing in certain segments. I'm not in that segment. What do I do? And I think what you'd find in the venture capital industry, the firms who are the most successful over the long term develop a real discipline around only investing in their target investment thesis, right? So their investment thesis is in whatever it is, women's e-commerce, right? And you are a chemical sciences company, they're just not going to invest in you, right? That's the biggest thing. So don't think you're going to be the exception. Don't think you're going to be different. Move on to try and find the firms that will invest in you. And so if you've identified a specific fund that invests in your specific thesis, you have a much better chance of success. If you're trying to pitch a fund whose target thesis is well outside of what your industry is, don't waste your cycles, because they're just not going to do it, right? That'd be the first thing. So go back and try and go back to that Crunchbase example. Go back and you can find firms who are interested in your specific space and also invest in your specific geography, right? So I think a lot of entrepreneurs are optimistic and think they can overcome every obstacle. But the reality is, if a fund has an investment thesis in a certain segment that's not yours, they're not going to invest in you. Don't waste cycles on it. Same thing. If like I had a venture capital firm here in the US I had a good relationship with. I have a German client who is closing on a $10 million B round right now. So they've done a really good job. We went to this firm with this German client, and the partner told me in the first 5 minutes, he said, hey, our limited partner agreement prohibits us from investing outside the US, right? So at that point, the meeting was over. I wasn't going to waste a 6th minute on that discussion. They cannot invest in a German company. Thank you. Good to see you. Have a great day. And move on. Don't think you're going to be an exception. If they don't invest if you're based in the Nordics and they don't invest outside the US, you're not going to be an exception. Go find funds who do. So you can actually go to Crunchbase and you can pull a list of US venture firms who invest in your segment and also invest in Europe. Find the people who want to invest in what your company does. Don't try and convince people who want to invest in a different segment or geography that you're going to be different and special and better.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, it like on the experience that I have had here, it's obvious, but like I grew up in Mexico, and the experience that I have there is that they're more like this kind of like general investors. They go more for the idea rather than the industry. But unfortunately, with Mexico, there are a lot of law that impediments that prohibit investors to invest outside of Mexico. So that's one of the issues that
And
I
also,
have
Karen,
going.
and they're really big U.S. firms. So take ones you probably heard of, Sequoia or Lightspeed or Andreessen Horowitz. Their firms have billions and billions of dollars under management, and they'll typically have a whole bunch of different segments and sizes. So they'll have a seed stage fund. They're going to have someone who does clean tech. They'll have somebody who does biotech. And so there's probably a certain amount of funds who invest across the board. And then the secret is trying to find who's the right partner who's thinking about your specific area. So that's the other way to kind of slice that up.
And so in the sense of I mean, so it mostly depends on the investor and where the investor is, or whose partners are, whether it's a limited partner or a VC, if they are able to invest on the US. It's not like it's not a general consensus.
So some funds are very open and eager to invest in Europe. A lot of the bigger US funds have been opening offices in London just to try and get better reach into the region. And some just very specifically don't. I had an investor who I really liked, who really liked me, but he was in Los Angeles, and he's like, David, I really like you, I really like your company, but we're not going to invest in you. I'm like, well, why not? He said, because we're very active investors. He said, all my portfolio companies are in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. I go to board meetings there all the time. I am not going to get on an airplane and fly to North Carolina for a single company. Right. I'm just not going to invest that time just to be there, be on a flight once a month to go to North Carolina to be on your board meeting. And so they're just, I went in the right geography. They didn't like the company or the presentation. They just don't invest in North Carolina, unfortunately.
Okay.
And I actually had, I think, Karen, just kind of further reiterate, I had another venture capitalist who really liked my company. So I had a hardware component and a software component. And he really liked us, but he said, David, I can't invest in you. And I said, well, why? He said, you need to understand, when I go out to raise money from limited partners, I go out to them with a very specific investment thesis. And I'm telling them that I invest in SaaS software companies. And I'm like, well, we do have a SaaS component. He said, but you also have hardware. He said, so if I go outside my investment theme to what I've promised my investors and things go well and you have a great exit, everybody's happy. If I go outside my investment thesis and things go poorly, I go out of business and get sued into oblivion. So like trying to get an investor to change what their investment themes are, because I for my company, because I think I'm special or different, they're just not going to do it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Hope that helps. Any other questions on U.S. market, U.S. entry, venture capital? All right, Christian, I think, is that it?
Well, if everyone is satisfied and there's no more questions, then we made it through in good time and actually ahead of schedule.
All right. Well, again, my email address is david@usexpansionpartners.com. Please feel free to reach out. I'll send the deck to Jeanette, and I'm happy to share that with everybody. And like I said, feel free to reach out to me if you ever have questions about the U.S. market, venture capital fundraising, U.S. expansion. I will be at the TNA event in Helsinki on the 29th. And I'll also be at the Slush event on the 30th. So I hope to get to meet many of you in person. Look forward to that.
Great. See you there.
All right. Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you
All right,
there.
thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Good to meet
See
you. Look
you.
forward to meeting everyone in person.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Christian. I'll email you